Did you ever think you would see the day when a single trip to the grocery store would feel like a luxury? For our generation, the cost of putting honest food on the table was predictable, fair, and steady. But in 2026, a silent and deeply troubling food crisis is breaking the very logic we have relied on our entire lives.
The entire pricing structure compresses upward. This is where financial stability stopped acting as insulation. Households that were not traditionally price-sensitive began adjusting behavior, comparing stores, cutting non-essentials, delaying purchases. The significance of that shift cannot be overstated. When higher-income consumers begin reacting the same way lower-income groups already have, it signals pressure moving through the entire system, not just its edges. And that pressure shows up in ratios. The federal minimum wage remains $7.25 per hour, yet in some areas, a single pound of beef approaches or exceeds that hourly rate. That comparison matters because it reframes food not as a routine expense, but as a growing share of labor. The more hours required to afford the same basket of goods, the more strain accumulates beneath the surface. From there, the issue evolves beyond affordability into something more structural. Because once pricing detaches from expectations across multiple categories at the same time, it suggests that this isn't isolated volatility. It's a broader recalibration. And that realization leads directly into the next layer of the problem. Even when people continue paying these higher prices, what they're actually getting in return is quietly changing as well. And once that pricing disconnect became visible, the next layer of the problem emerged. What people were actually receiving in return began to deteriorate. Because rising costs alone would be one thing, but paying more while the product itself quietly declines is something else entirely. This is where the system shifts from inflation into value erosion. Across grocery shelves, the changes are subtle but measurable. Package sizes shrink while price tags remain elevated, a process often masked through redesigns and labeling adjustments. A standard 16-ounce product becomes 13 or 14 ounces, yet still sells for $4.99 or $5.99. On paper, the increase looks moderate. In reality, the cost per unit climbs far more aggressively. At the same time, ingredient quality is being recalibrated. Higher-cost inputs are replaced with cheaper substitutes to protect margins. Oils are swapped, fillers are introduced, processing increases. In protein categories, this becomes more visible. Lower grade cuts, water retention techniques, and chemical tenderizers alter both texture and nutritional density. What appears to be the same product is no longer structurally identical. The result is a two-layered pressure. The price per item rises, while the actual value extracted from that item declines. That gap is where frustration turns into distrust. Because consumers are no longer just questioning affordability. They're questioning authenticity. This is especially evident in categories once considered reliable benchmarks of quality. Meat, dairy, and packaged staples have all undergone quiet reformulations. Even when price comparisons suggest parity, $9.99 per pound here versus $10.49 elsewhere, the underlying composition is often different. Added solutions, preservatives, and bulk-enhancing techniques distort what that price truly represents. And this degradation isn't accidental. It's a calculated response to sustained cost pressure across supply chains. Companies are attempting to maintain accessibility while preserving profitability, but the trade-off is hidden inside the product itself, which leads to a more critical realization. The consumer is no longer just paying for food, they are paying for an increasingly engineered version of it. And once that becomes normalized, the definition of cheap begins to collapse entirely. Because if lower-priced options no longer deliver real value, and higher-priced options no longer guarantee quality, then the entire pricing spectrum loses its meaning. That collapse in value leads directly into the next rupture, where the last remaining safety net in the food system begins to fail. Because for decades, there was always a fallback. If grocery bills climbed too high, there was still one place people could turn: cheap, fast, accessible food. That model no longer holds. The entire foundation of low-cost dining was built on a simple equation: speed and affordability in exchange for lower quality. But once affordability disappears, the equation breaks instantly. A basic combo meal that once hovered around $6 to $8 is now routinely priced between $12 and $15 in many areas. In some cases, a single item approaches $7 or $8 on its own. That's not a marginal increase, that's a structural shift in positioning. And the problem isn't just the price itself, it's the gap between price and expectation, because while costs have escalated, the product hasn't evolved to justify it. Portion sizes remain controlled, ingredient sourcing remains optimized for cost efficiency, and preparation methods remain unchanged. The consumer is being asked to pay near-restaurant pricing for a product that was never designed to operate in that tier. This creates a breakdown in consumer logic. When the difference between a fast food meal and a freshly prepared alternative shrinks to $2 or $3, the entire purpose of the cheaper option disappears. The system begins competing against itself. Convenience alone is no longer enough to sustain demand at elevated price points. What follows is a shift in behavior that extends beyond individual choices. Traffic begins to decline. Value menus expand in an attempt to retain price-sensitive customers. Promotions become more aggressive, signaling underlying demand pressure. These are early indicators of strain, not growth. And this strain doesn't remain isolated, because once the lowest tier of food access becomes unstable, it removes a critical pressure release valve from the system. There is no longer a reliable downshift option for consumers trying to manage rising costs. That absence forces a new kind of decision-making, one that prioritizes trade-offs over convenience. And as those decisions become more frequent, they begin to expose something deeper. The same product in the same category can carry dramatically different price tags depending on where and how it's sold. Once that fallback option weakens, consumers are pushed back into the grocery system, but what they encounter there is no longer consistent. The same basket of food can produce two completely different totals depending on where it's purchased, and the gap is no longer minor, it's extreme. Across many regions, a near-identical set of items can cost $220 to $260 at a traditional supermarket, while discount chains offer a comparable basket for $110 to $130. That's not a small variation driven by brand preference. It's a 2x price spread inside the same category of essential goods. And that spread forces a new kind of behavior. Shopping is no longer passive. It becomes strategic. Consumers begin mapping routes between stores, splitting purchases, prioritizing one location for produce, another for packaged goods, another for bulk. Time becomes part of the cost equation. A 20 to 30-minute drive is now justified if it saves $80 or more on a weekly bill. This is where access starts to define affordability. Not everyone has the ability to travel, compare, or optimize. Households without reliable transportation, flexible schedules, or proximity to lower-cost retailers are effectively locked into higher-price environments. Two families can buy the same food, yet one consistently pays 40 to 60% more simply because of location. At the same time, branding obscures ownership. Multiple labels on the shelf suggest competition, but a significant portion of those products trace back to a small number of parent companies. That concentration limits how much true price competition actually exists. What appears to be variety is often a controlled spectrum. And then there's the pricing structure itself. Traditional chains carry higher operating costs, real estate, labor, inventory complexity, which are passed directly to the consumer. Discount models strip those layers down, offering fewer choices but tighter pricing. The result is a bifurcated system, one optimized for margin, the other for volume. This divide reshapes how food is experienced. It's no longer just about what people eat, but where they are allowed to buy it. And as that gap widens, it introduces a more unsettling possibility. Prices are not just different across locations. They may also be adapting, quietly and continuously, based on how individuals behave within the system itself. And once price differences can no longer be explained by location or store format alone, the next layer becomes harder to ignore. Pricing itself is no longer static. It's adaptive. Behind the shelves and digital storefronts, a system has been developing that doesn't just set prices, it studies behavior. Every purchase, every click, every hesitation feeds into models designed to answer a single question. How much is each individual willing to pay? This is not theoretical. Dynamic pricing infrastructure already exists across e-commerce, and it's increasingly integrated into grocery delivery platforms and retail systems. Algorithms track patterns, how often someone buys, what brands they choose, whether they react to discounts, how quickly they check out. From there, pricing strategies adjust in small increments. Not enough to trigger alarm, but enough to maximize revenue over time. That means the price you see is not always a fixed reflection of cost. It can be a calculated estimate of your tolerance. A shopper who consistently selects premium options signals low price sensitivity. Over time, that behavior can lead to fewer discounts, higher baseline pricing, or less visibility of lower-cost alternatives. Meanwhile, a more price-conscious shopper may be presented with promotions or cheaper substitutions to keep them engaged. The difference doesn't appear as a dramatic jump. It happens in cents, then dollars, spread across dozens of transactions. But across a year, that optimization can translate into hundreds of extra dollars extracted from the same household for the same categories of goods. And this system doesn't operate in isolation. It works alongside loyalty programs, digital coupons, and app-based ordering systems, all of which require user data to function. What looks like convenience is also a feedback loop. The more someone participates, the more precise the pricing model becomes. This changes the nature of the marketplace entirely. Pricing is no longer just about supply and demand. It's about data and prediction. And when that layer is combined with the structural pressures already building beneath the surface, it leads to a critical conclusion. Prices are not simply rising because they have to. In many cases, they are rising because the system has learned that they can. When pricing systems learn how far they can push, the next question becomes unavoidable. What's stopping those prices from coming back down? Because if the increases were temporary, driven by short-term shocks, there would be a natural reversal. But that reversal isn't happening, and the reason lies deeper than any single factor. At the base level, there is still inflation, but not the kind that fades quickly. Between 2020 and 2025, overall food prices climbed roughly 25 to 30%, and many categories remain elevated even as headline inflation slows. That's because the underlying cost structure has shifted upward. Once suppliers, distributors, and retailers adjust to higher cost levels, those increases tend to stick. Prices reset to a new floor rather than returning to the previous baseline. Layered on top of that is market concentration. A significant share of food production and distribution is controlled by a small number of corporations. In sectors like meat processing, just a handful of companies dominate supply. That level of consolidation reduces competitive pressure. When fewer players control more of the chain, pricing power becomes centralized, and centralized pricing rarely moves downward without external force. Then there's the global dimension. The United States imports a substantial portion of its fruits, vegetables, and key ingredients. That means domestic grocery prices are tied directly to international trade conditions. Tariffs, shipping costs, currency fluctuations, each adds incremental pressure. A container cost increase overseas doesn't stay overseas. It shows up at the shelf, embedded in the final price of everyday items. Labor adds another layer. Food production, processing, transportation, and retail all depend on large workforces. Wage increases, labor shortages, and regulatory changes all feed into operating costs. And once those costs are absorbed into pricing, they rarely reverse, even if conditions stabilize later. What emerges from these overlapping forces is not a temporary spike, but a structural shift. Costs are higher across every stage, from farm to shelf, and each stage reinforces the next, which leads to a critical realization. This isn't a system waiting to normalize. It's a system that has recalibrated itself to operate at a higher level permanently. Once it becomes clear that prices are not reverting, the impact shifts from financial strain into something deeper: psychological adaptation. Because when a system stops behaving like a temporary disruption, people stop reacting to it as one. They begin adjusting to it. At first, the response is resistance. Budgets tighten, substitutions are made. Households try to preserve previous habits by reallocating spending. But that phase doesn't last. When the numbers don't cooperate, when $120 turns into $180 consistently, resistance gives way to recalibration. Expectations are lowered. What used to feel expensive starts to feel normal. That normalization is where the real shift occurs, because once a $7 item no longer triggers hesitation, the internal benchmark has moved. And when millions of consumers adjust those benchmarks at the same time, it reshapes demand across the entire system. Higher prices stop feeling like anomalies and start feeling like the baseline. From there, behavior becomes more defensive. Spending is no longer about preference. It becomes about control. Households begin setting hard limits: $100 per week, $400 per month, fixed caps that force decisions in real time. Each item added to a cart is weighed against something else that must be removed, not because options disappeared, but because flexibility did. And this is where concern replaces frustration, because the system starts demanding trade-offs that didn't exist before: quality versus quantity, nutrition versus cost, fresh versus shelf-stable. These are not lifestyle choices. They are constraints imposed by pricing pressure. What makes this phase more unstable is that it spreads quietly. There's no visible breaking point, no sudden collapse, just a gradual tightening that people internalize. Credit usage for essentials begins to rise. Savings rates weaken. Discretionary spending contracts, not out of caution but out of necessity. And yet, outwardly, everything still appears functional. Stores remain stocked, transactions continue. But underneath, the behavior sustaining that system is changing. People are no longer engaging because they want to. They're engaging because they have to. That distinction matters, because once participation becomes forced rather than voluntary, the system becomes more fragile than it looks. And that fragility raises a final question: what happens when there are no more adjustments left to make? And that is where the system quietly approaches its limit, when there are no more adjustments left to make. Because every phase before this relied on one assumption: that households would continue adapting. Cutting here, substituting there, stretching a little further each month. But adaptation is not infinite. It has a ceiling. Once that ceiling is reached, the pressure doesn't disappear. It shifts. The first sign is demand compression, not a sudden drop, but a gradual pullback. Consumers begin buying less overall, not by choice, but by constraint. Calorie intake shifts toward cheaper density. Fresh categories lose volume. Higher margin items stall. When enough households start reducing consumption at the same time, it feeds directly back into the system that depends on consistent demand to sustain pricing. Then comes the second layer: financial substitution. When income can't cover essentials, the gap is filled elsewhere. Credit cards, buy now, pay later services, short-term borrowing. In the United States, revolving credit has already crossed $1 trillion. That number doesn't rise because people are thriving. It rises because essentials are being financed. Food, historically the most basic cash expense, begins to migrate into debt-backed consumption. That is not a stable equilibrium. At the same time, mid-tier systems begin to fracture. Retailers positioned between premium and discount face the most pressure. They cannot compete with the lowest-cost operators on price, and they cannot justify premium positioning without clear differentiation. Traffic thins out. Margins compress. Closures begin, not as isolated events, but as a pattern. And yet, even as these cracks form, the surface still looks intact. Shelves remain stocked. Transactions still process. But what's sustaining that appearance is no longer organic demand. It's forced participation, supported by shrinking flexibility and expanding financial strain. That's what makes this phase dangerous, because the system doesn't fail all at once. It weakens gradually while still functioning, and that creates the illusion that it can continue indefinitely. But it can't, because once essential consumption begins competing with financial stability, something has to give. Either prices adjust downward, which current structures resist, or consumption adjusts downward, which eventually feeds back into the system itself. And when that feedback loop closes, it doesn't look like a dramatic collapse. It looks quieter than that. Fewer items in carts, smaller purchases, longer gaps between trips. Until one day, the realization sets in, not that food became expensive, but that access to it has fundamentally changed. And by the time that realization becomes widespread, the system isn't on the edge anymore, it's already crossed it.